This is Alyson coming to you with a very special guest today. We have Gina Hogan from H2H Insurance. Gina, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today.
Thank you for asking me. This is amazing.
Yeah, Gina, we've known you a long time. You
Yeah.
and Oliver go way back decades. We won't say how long.
Over a decade. Let's
Yes,
put it that way.
we'll put it that way. And it has never been more important to have the right partners in this business. I say that all the time. And I think that it is interesting times in our industry, and
Yes.
making sure you have a team of people around you that understand what it takes to not only get you into a home, but have that home insured, and make sure that you can sleep at night knowing that things were done correctly is super important. So we appreciate you and everything that you do for our clients. And I think the reason that we wanted to have this conversation is right now, the Florida insurance market is a hot topic.
Yes. It's getting a little bit better, but it's been a hot topic for quite a few years.
Yeah. And just like anything else, there's so much misinformation and misunderstanding, and quite frankly, just a lack of respect for people that are actually trying to get insurance for their homes. I call it clickbait, right? There's things that people like to talk about on social media that are just straight up not true. So I think today I wanted to talk to you about the state of the insurance market, and ultimately give people the education and information that they need. So again, I appreciate you being here.
That sounds great. Definitely.
So first, let's talk about the general misunderstanding of properties not being insured in the Florida market. Like you said, it's getting better,
Yeah.
but talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So a lot of people, they're looking for the big name brands. And it is true, the big name brands you're not able to get very often in Florida. Progressive is extremely picky. Geico is extremely picky. So people, they may be coming from up north. They might have had one carrier for like 20, 30 years. They call them, they can't get it here. So they assume like, oh, I can't get insurance in Florida. In Florida, it's a little bit different. The carriers that we often use, you're not going to know their names because they're not on TV. They're not Flow. They're not the Lizard, like paying all the advertising, because you have to go through insurance brokers to get to them. So they're not wasting their money necessarily advertising to the consumers because they have to advertise to the agents. So a lot of the carriers we use, you can't just call them and get a policy. You have to go through an agent.
Yep.
So then, and sometimes, people are like, well, I've never heard of this carrier. And I get that, but that's the reason why. It's because they're not on TV because you can't go to them directly.
Right. And we're brokers. You're a broker.
Yes.
The broker world is growing. I think a lot of people are paying attention to not only the service that you can get from the broker model, if that's the right word, but also the savings that can be passed on. Right. And to your point, someone is paying for the Lizard, someone is paying for Flow, and that someone is the consumer. Right. Let's just be honest.
Yeah.
So
And we
that's
have
just
the
the
ability
reality.
to shop too. So when you call a broker, you're only going through their carrier. And sometimes their carrier is better than what I can get. And if I look at it, I tell them that. But for the
Yep.
most part, you're better off having somebody that can look at multiple markets. Some of the big carriers, I think they're starting to see, like, for example, Geico, they're not writing on their paper here, but they're starting to try to pull some of the carriers that we have access to. But what I've noticed is because they're working for, let's say, Geico, and when you call like the 1-800 number, you're getting just a random person that deals with all the states. So they're not specialized in Florida. Like, they're going through, for example, Security First is a carrier they're going through. And Security First has this little odd quirk where they put their pools under the other structure coverage. And I've seen so many quotes people have sent me from Geico with a pool not there because they're not, writing in the Florida market every
They
day.
don't understand the market, and
Yeah.
they don't understand like those little nuances and quirks, right? It's really important to work with somebody that understands the market. And the Florida market is very different, both for
Mhm.
us and for you. So to
Yeah.
understand kind of like minefields probably isn't the right word, but those little kind of holes that
Yeah.
we have to navigate. Well, that's really helpful. And word on the street, folks, properties are insurable in Florida. So you heard it here first from Gina.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, if you have a 1920s property, is there probably only going to be maybe 2 or 3 carriers to choose from? Yes, but those are carriers and those carriers are
Right.
fine and they work.
Exactly. Yeah,
So,
exactly. And it's all about risk, as we know. So as far as I know flood is, because you do homeowners and you do flood, right? You can insure both.
yep,
Flood has been on the sort of hot press lately.
yep.
It's getting really expensive. Oh, I don't want to be flood zone. So why don't you talk to me a little bit about some of the changes in the flood insurance market?
Yeah. So, October 2021, FEMA went in and made a pretty big change where they said they are going to, the goal is to have everybody pay the actual rate of what they think the risk of your property is. There used to be, if you were in, so I always say, I know a lot of people say in a flood zone, not in a flood zone, but I always say everybody in Florida is in the flood zone. It's just high risk and low risk.
Yep.
Yeah, it used to be everybody in zone X, the low risk flood zone, had the same rate. It was a chart you picked from. Now it doesn't matter what zone you're in. Everybody, each home has their own rate now. And it's what FEMA is saying is the inherent risk of that home. There's some areas like that got hit where it could be like $6,000-7,000, like downtown St. Pete somewhere. And they're saying, well, that's the actual risk that we're taking on. And before they were getting like a subsidized rate, so the premium that FEMA was collecting wasn't enough to pay the claims out. Like they've been bleeding money for years and years and years.
That's
And
what it's all about, is that
yes,
balance is now tipped and the scale is tipped, which everyone should know, right? That shouldn't be like surprising. If you logically think about it, there was a tipping point, and that's why
yeah,
this 2021
yes.
thing
And
was
they've been
enacted.
trying
Okay.
to change this for a very long time. Like Bigger Waters, they did an act. I want to say probably 8 or 9 years ago, and then it was repealed. So they've been like brainstorming, trying to fix this for a very, very long time. There's some states in a lawsuit trying to sue FEMA for this change. I don't know if that's going to go anywhere because I feel like just from what I've seen, Florida's gotten hit pretty bad. I mean, I don't work in other states, but they say FEMA said like, oh, a lot of people aren't going to see a rate increase, but in the areas that we work in Florida,
We've
it's
seen it.
yeah, I mean, you can have, so the good thing is if there's an existing flood policy in place, they let you basically like grandfather take over that, the discount that current homeowner was getting. But you have somebody, if there's not a flood policy in place and they're paying
Right.
like the actual risk now, it could be like $7,000-8,000 in certain areas. And
Right. And that's really important too. Something that we do differently is we're always, and thanks to you and your team's work, we're always going to pull a true quote. So let's talk about that, because I think that might be the biggest thing, right? So people shop around and say, wow, that seems really expensive. I'm going to go shop elsewhere. And why are these quotes so different? So what's going on there, Gina?
well, every agent has their own way of how they do things. Some people, they just add all the max wind mitigation credits. Wind mitigation is something that we have in Florida where it talks about how the roof's attached.
Yep.
Those are really big credits. Those could be a few $1,000s. There's some agents that will quote like a 1930s, 40s home with clips, and it's not very often that those home have clips. So we always quote worst case. Our quotes can be higher off the bat, but we tell you that like we need the wind mitigation to verify us, adjust those quotes, because I never want anybody to go in with maybe a best case quote and think that they can afford the home and then not be able to and lose their deposit. So I mean that every agent has their own preference with how they do things, and I always quote worst case.
Exactly. And a lot of people are underquoting,
Mhm.
and they're underquoting to such an extent that that isn't even a real quote,
Yeah.
right? So in no way, shape, or form, because everyone needs to understand when you're taking out a mortgage on a home, right, there needs to be a certain amount of insurance to ensure, because I mean, the lender owns the home until you eventually potentially pay that home off. That's their risk. Insurance is a part of that. So
Yes.
I think sometimes people don't think about that, right? They're like, oh, it's insurance for me. It's like, no, really, that institution that's loaning you that big chunk of money needs to see. And with a really low quote, that won't pass underwriting. And
Yeah.
we've seen that happen. And so a lot of these insurance agents, like if, we don't work with you on something, that can become a really big problem. So that's really important for people. If you're getting a really low quote, really of any kind of quote, you should probably go like, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, unless it's brand new construction's still pretty low, but
Right.
otherwise, you definitely should second guess that, because you don't want anything, your deal to fall through at the end.
Exactly. You lose money, you lose time, it's
Yeah.
emotional, you have your
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
packed in a box. It's like, don't
Ah,
put yourself in that position.
yeah, and that's like my biggest fear is, I mean, and once in a while it happens where there's a credit that they should have for that H home and they don't get it and it goes up, but I hate that. So I always, try to do everything to avoid that. I mean, it happens sometimes, but we, like I said, always quote worst case for that situation.
Right. That's really good to know. So people should watch out for that. So talk to us, last question. So there's more competition coming into the market, right? You and I had talked about there's new carriers. So guys, this is not hopeless. There is, everyone's like, oh, insurance, but there's actually some really good stuff happening within the insurance industry. So why don't you talk to us about that? And then how do you think that might impact rates? I mean, you don't have a crystal ball, and
Yeah.
we're obviously not asking you to predict, but talk to
Yeah.
us about that.
Well, the more competition, the more people are gonna like carriers might start to lower their rates because they're not getting anything. Like when there were so limited carriers writing, which there was a few years ago, it was like on one hand, you can count how many carriers were writing. They could basically put their rates to whatever they wanted because they were like the only ones that were willing to do it and take
Yeah.
that risk on. Now that there's more competition, people have more carriers to shop with. If they don't lower their rates, they're not going to get any business.
Yep.
So the new carriers are going to help. And not only that, but just the carriers that are starting to open up their guidelines more. There was a time where some carriers weren't accepting homes over 5 years old. So every time a carrier is like, okay, well now we'll accept 20 and newer, now we'll accept 30 and newer, even though that's not a new carrier, it's a new carrier like for that
Right. So they may expand their, I don't know if you call it offering or whatever you would
yeah,
call it,
their
right? They
appetite.
expand that. And then ultimately the competition is like, oh, well, no one's going to come. This is happening in the food industry. This is happening in the healthcare industry. A lot of the structures like buying a home or, going to the hospital, like things are changing rapidly in every industry, and more competition is better,
Yes,
right? So that
absolutely.
can only help the homeowners moving forward.
Oh, definitely. And then we've already seen some of it, like just for these last few months, we've had 9 carriers take a decrease and 10 carriers not take an increase. Now, when I say take a decrease too, like, some people they see that news article, they call, they're like, well, my policy didn't go down. These carriers that took the decrease, they were some of the ones that were so high in premium
Right.
versus them closing. They
Yeah.
just priced
Hopefully
themselves
you
out of
weren't
the
with
game.
that carrier that was just egregiously, you probably wouldn't have quoted
Yeah,
that as your best case anyway. So
exactly.
that's why people, yeah, totally.
Exactly. But just the fact that they're willing to creep down, eventually, if they keep doing that, they're going to be back in that, like in that ballpark. So
Right.
them not going up is a positive, in my opinion, because they're starting to go back down where they were so high that because they didn't want the business, they priced themselves out. So, I mean, that's a positive.
Right. And as far as like, we'll call that kind of the foundation where the competition sits. So let's call this, whatever that general quote that you're getting for a specific property. eh, What was crazy, especially about mortgage rates too, is just everything was going up, 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 up. I mean, it was wild. And that's what was happening in the insurance market. Do you see kind of it coming back down to a place where it's not rapidly increasing? Does it seem to be cooling a little
It's
bit?
cooling. Yeah,
Okay.
it's definitely cooling. The rate increases we're seeing this year. I mean, and obviously there's the outlier to every situation, but most of them are maybe like two, three, $400, where a year or two ago, it would be like I would hold my breath opening my renewals, $1,000,
Right.
1,400, 2,000. Like, so it's definitely slowing down and like tapering off a little bit.
Good. Well, that's really good news. And I think people
Yeah,
should feel good about that,
definitely.
especially in a world that's inundated with constant fear and everything is terrible. It's nice to know that everything isn't terrible.
Yeah, it's just
So,
you gotta ride it out. It's like everything. There's like, you have the hills and we've had markets like this before. Like when I first started insurance, gosh, like 13 years ago, all the carriers were locked down because for something different, it was sinkhole fraud. where nobody was wanting to write. And then, there was legislation, it was fixed, people started to open up little by little. And then we were in a great market where carriers were like begging to write with you. So, I mean,
Right.
it
It's all
goes up and
cyclical,
down. Mhm.
like everything else.
It's just a
And I
cycle.
think too, the other thing with insurance that people have to understand, it is pretty, I don't want to say it's government regulated, more so it's government driven. Because ultimately, that's the government has to step in. Things
Mhm.
get crazy, there's fraud, things get too
Yep.
expensive. And we all know how quick that is. It's
I know.
slower than slow. So, but it's
Yeah.
just what it is, right? It's part of the deal. And that's what we have to deal with. So,
Yeah.
is there anything else that you think we should know? I mean, we covered all the points that I think we had talked
Um,
about.
yeah, just for especially I know this is going out to a lot of realtors, just to make sure you ask for that existing flood policy when you're shopping in a flood zone. Like that's the biggest thing is to get that policy because we can't just know that they have it. We have to input that number into our system to pull over what that current homeowner is getting because I mean that can make or break a property, the flood. So just always ask
Absolutely.
if there's an existing policy in place and can I have a copy of it?
Perfect. That's really good advice.
Yeah.
So we will get that out to the masses. So thank you so much, Gina.
Yeah.
We'll go ahead and link Gina's information below, her website and her contact information. And we appreciate everything you do for us and for our clients and realtors. And thank you so much for educating us.
I appreciate you guys so much too. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina.